Welcome to Support Life, a program focusing on current social issues from a life-affirming perspective. I'm Gavin Bolch, and my guest today is Geraldine Lee. Welcome, Geraldine.
Thanks.
Good. Now, you've got quite a kind of a family history in arts, and it seems like things began over in Malaysia. Where did you spend your early years?
I spent my earliest when I was born in London, actually, and I was there for 3 years, and then we went back to Malaysia because my dad got a scholarship to go to the Royal College of Art, and I was born there.
Good. Okay, so do you remember much about Malaysia?
After London, I stayed there from about 3 years old to 11 years. I suppose from my memory, there were happy times, but my happy times was mainly food, and which means that I put on a bit of weight. And my sad times were something happened to me around childhood, about, I'm not sure, 7, 8, and I sort of started to have low self-esteem and had kind of depression, sort of childhood, because I used to think about my funeral quite a bit. Yeah, and I have a brother and 2 sisters who are disabled, so I think that was part of it, when I realized later that they, that their disease was incurable. Yeah. Okay,
so did you feel like special, or why were they suffering and you weren't? Was it something?
Yes, I think I had a feeling of guilt that why was I well and they disabled. Initially, I was like any child does, became quite naughty because I thought they're getting more attention, but I suppose they had to because they had needs like going to hospitals and doctor's appointments. But from a childhood perspective, I thought there must be something wrong with me, that my parents have less time with me. And because of that, I became annoying and picked on them and bullied them. But then when I came to the Lord when I was 16, I was like, I kind of made a barter with God. If I'm a good girl, then they're going to be healed. But I suppose that sort of gave me that perspective on the importance of life, even when they're disabled children.
And God even uses these deals we make with Him, doesn't He?
Yes, He does.
So they weren't healed?
Oh, they're not healed, but they live longer than I expected, than the doctors expected. And I suppose they've led fairly successful lives, maybe by the world standards. 2 of them are lawyers and one's a social worker, and all of them are in relationships, and 2 of them have children.
Wow. You see, I think Jesus says, because someone comes and talks about the child who's disabled and says, well, is this because of the parent's sin or the child's sin? And Jesus says, no, it's for my glory. So God has a plan, and you're now touching on a plan He had for them. I mean, here are disabled people. Is that the right term here?
Yes, my brother and sisters. I suppose you would call them a person with a disability rather than a disabled person.
But still, people think of this other term, and then God says, I'll show you something.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And it also gets us off our couch potato position, doesn't it?
Yes. And I suppose it, because having also myself as a nurse background, I've realized that at the time when I was working in different hospitals, that maybe not the Christian ones, there were babies who were disabled who were sometimes starved to death, which shocked me because they had things like Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis, and these hospitals would not intervene if the parents didn't want the child.
Wow!
So they would die kind of naturally, but they could have actually had operations too. So because I went to a Catholic hospital, I was shocked because I worked as an agency nurse for a while, and I was sent to hospitals where they believed if the parents didn't want the children, then they kind of like passive euthanasia.
Yes. Okay, now let's bring this collective of life's experiences, some darkness for yourself, depression, siblings who were, they had needs, all right? Now, all of that's impacted you because now, just briefly, but we'll go back to your past life, but now, just briefly, you're reaching out to people in need, aren't you?
Yes, I work with, I've got some clients with I Choose Life. We help people in financial hardship, and there are some of the people who suffer mental illness, some people have drug dependency, and some people have, I suppose, have been discriminated against, yes. and they get caught in the gaps, because certain cultures, like say refugees and people from other countries, they don't get the government benefits, and what happens is they, in financial hardship, and they get so depressed, some of them get suicidal even. Yeah, so in a sense, yeah, there's a bit of a connection with my prevention. I desire to help people to realize that every life is precious.
All right. So there's a human condition, and we say, well, let's have empathy for people. But there's a higher, more intense position, which is compassion and the compassion of Christ. The degrees of those three things, can you talk about that a little bit? There's a human response, but there's a godly response.
Yes, I suppose when I was nursing, I suppose I have a Christian background where, in St. Vincent's Hospital, I suppose, and that we were always taught the dignity of every person, whether they were a stroke client, stroke patient, or whether they were very, very severely disabled, or whether they had a sexual disease, to treat them with the utmost dignity. And I suppose some people in the medical field have a tendency to believe that if their brain's not there, or they're not thinking too much, or if they're not wanted, then their life is not as precious. And probably an example of this was I worked with a nurse where she was doing abortions during the day, and during the night she worked in one of the hospitals where I was working. And because she had this idea that life's not that precious and it depends how much people want them, she, I was a student then and I didn't really understand fully what was happening. And she said, "Oh, this elderly man, we need more beds and that sort of thing, and he's and I said, doesn't he have to be in pain to get an injection?" She says, "Oh, let's put the old bugger out, end his life." And I was like shocked, and because I was a very young nurse at the time, I was like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do and all this, and then and then within a few hours he died, and because they're given a drug, like higher, if you give morphine higher than they need, it can actually, if they're very frail, die.
Yeah. Well, on that horrific note, we'll come back. You're watching Support Life, and we will be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Bolch and my guest is Geraldine Lee. Geraldine, we heard some really interesting comments by others, like, what's the use, why do we bother, let's put this old bugger out of his pain.
Yeah, and I think that it would be also the case of someone who's drug dependent, because when I was working in one hospital doing agency, I came across this patient who had drug addiction and attempted suicide, and they were saying, the same things the people in the emergency department were saying. Oh, this is costing us $5,000 to $10,000 worth of equipment. Why bother, trying to save their life? They don't contribute to society. They're a drug dependent person, and they want to die anyway. So why bother saving their lives? And there I was taking syringing out from the metho, which they took, and it was sad because as I was pulling out the metho, the syringes were actually disintegrating, but surprisingly, which was fantastic, they actually lived. But the nurses and doctors were complaining about the the bed use and the fact that they had that, So I suppose we live in a society of economic viability.
Yes.
It's if it doesn't cost much money, it's you're more valuable. If you make money, you're more valuable. If you use the resources of the world, then you're not so valuable, and you're not wanted too, because you're either old or sick or drug dependent.
So you can justify euthanasia. You can, if it's driven by money and economics. A life has a value of not much. I think Hitler discovered a person's made up of so many nails and a couple of cakes of soap, and you can put a bicycle seat of human leather. The skin can go a long way. Yes,
and that worries me too. When I was working as a nurse, was that there were doctors who persuaded patients their families and said to get off machines, which sometimes I've experienced looking after people who are in comas. After a couple of weeks, they actually come back.
They do.
And that used to worry me, because there were sometimes young people or sometimes elderly people who were, they usually had something like depression, or they usually had something where the family were not, where the doctors were not precious enough, and they would push, taking people off machines. But I'm not so much against taking people off machines, so much so as what's happening in our society today, where they're trying to legalize, assisted suicide, And when I was working in one hospital, there was a patient who was quite well physically, but he had depression, and so there was this, and he wanted to starve himself to death. And some of the doctors and nurses who were pro-euthanasia were saying, well, he wants to die. So, and the others were saying, but he is actually well, and maybe after his depression, so there was a battle between some saying we should tube feed him and intravenously, and the others were like, well, if he wants to starve to death, let him. So it was difficult working in those areas where life issues are being challenged, And I went to a pro-life talk, and this lady called Barbara, she had a husband who was in a semi-comatose, and she refused to let them starve her husband to death, which they do in some hospitals. They don't give them intravenous fluids or nasogastric fluids, they just let them, they say, die comfortably. But she said that when the doctors didn't give him intravenous when he had an infection, he would be more stressed. He would, tighten her hand, he would scowl. And when he was intravenously, he actually relaxed. And he actually had a mission. The wife said that when even though he wasn't talking, nurses would sit by his bedside and cry, and they said they felt better in his presence. So that's the purpose. Sometimes even semi-comatose clients, they can actually transform lives.
Yes. Well, I've been in situations where people have been in comas, and I've just shared the gospel with them, and they've come out completely new people. And when I walk into the ward, they're listening. They're sort of sitting up in bed listening for a voice. And when they recognised my voice, they would say, "Thank you, brother, for taking me to a new space." And it's like, it's very interesting. So we can whisper words of grace and love and hope. They're still very much alive.
Yes, and a miracle can happen. I have nurse clients who get better even after being taken off the machine. They actually improve.
Yes, yes, no, that's wonderful. Now, let's go back to those dark times, those dark moments in your life. Did you find that what was a therapy, looking with hindsight?
When I had depression?
Yes.
Yeah, I found that when I sort of went back to thinking of reflecting on my life, that when I was in the creative arts, that used to help my depression, because when I went to Sydney and I didn't have the creative arts, when I compared the both times, depression got to me more in Sydney, where I wasn't involved in the creative arts as much. And yes, so it's a powerful source, and it gives people value. And so we have in our creative arts group I run a theatre group, and we have people who suffer depression and mental illness, and I see them spark up when they find a place to use their gifts in theatre.
Okay, well, Geraldine, we're going to come back to that thought. You're watching Support Life. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Bolch and my guest is Geraldine Lee. Geraldine, we've looked at the difficulties of where the mindset, the worldview of people that you've worked with in hospitals, doctors and nurses. Now, we touched on some dark moments in your life and how arts became a therapy, looking back with hindsight. Tell me about what your father does and your brother-in-law and how you got involved in the arts.
Yeah. So my father, from a very young age, was did lecturer in drama and art, and so from a very young age I got involved in it and acted in a few short movies and acted overseas in England. And my brother-in-law became a stage manager, and my dad started with us a theatre. Catholic theatre group or Christian theatre group called Friends of Cog, and we put on musicals, and then my other sister was running a theatre group called Amuse, and now we call it Amusability, so we include people with disabilities, and so those two theatre groups promote the culture of life, hope, and kind of inclusiveness, that everyone's valuable, and that we should take all people to join our cast from wherever. Yeah. Okay.
Now, some have quite intense disabilities, don't they?
Yeah. So some of the people in our drama group have been in wheelchairs, or they have had visual impairments, and some have had smaller things like dyslexia or difficulty with studies. But we work with people, and it's quite amazing. Like recently we put on a fundraiser for our theatre group and for the cyclone in Vanuatu. And one of the people who was helping us was so excited because they were being, they had a role to play, and they were just so pumped. It was just quite amazing. So we have people with disabilities, and initially, being a bit of a business, sometimes I'm very business-minded, thinking what looks good on camera, what looks good at reception. I was thinking, oh no, I can't put that person with a disability in that position. And then I felt God say, no, just let them be. And that just seeing the joy in their heart, being, discovering their gift, because what they were ending up happening was they liaised between the different departments, and they found that they had a purpose instead of, so that's what we do. We include everyone, and we see. And then we've had people in our theatre group who have had never been in theatre, and they like an elderly person of 60s, 70s, and they suddenly realize that they have this drama. They're like, before they were builders, and then they realize they have a gift, and that gives them a sense of value, a sense of being part of a group, a sense of I can do something in this group.
So they're quite cathartic moments, aren't they?
Yes, and I think in our theatre group, the good thing about musical theatre is there is a place for everyone, I believe, because you can either be doing front of house and doing ushering, or doing, with the money and the food, catering, or you could be an assistant stage manager or crowd control, or you could be acting on stage or singing, or you could be directing or musical direction, or you could be praying for the cast, while they go on and off stage, and or you could be part of the chorus. And we found that there was one of our shows where we had Mary on stage, and then we had the song "Come to Me," and we had people with disabilities in the chorus, and the audience were like tears because they saw people with disabilities come to Mary, come to God. And we've also had them in good roles, like we had a lady who had autism and she had the most fantastic voice, and she took on a main role, and it brought tears to her family's eyes, because some of autism never gets a chance to act, but she just flourished in her role, and she had the most magnificent voice, and she acted so well when she was on stage. She did struggle with social community situations, but what we did was we always made that aim to include her, and I could see her flourish.
Yes.
In fact, one of our cast members who had very dyslexia, she's now, right involved in professional theatre and doing courses in university courses, which is wonderful because, having not been very good academically, I can see her flourishing.
Yes, well, I wear blue glasses because I'm dyslexic. And words stopped moving on the page for the first time in something like 60 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, because she's still part of our theatre group. I might actually recommend that to her. Yes.
Okay, now what we're discovering is opportunity. We're perhaps discovering that miracles take place. We would call them miracles, right?
By being involved in theatre, it can be very healing, in a sense of people people in our workshops, when we do meditations, they feel a release of their depression. They feel, as they're acting out anger, they release their anger. Because I get, when I do some drama workshops, I'll say, act happy, act sad. And having a social work background, I usually say to them, now put pressure on my hand and think positive. And they notice that I'm stronger when I'm thinking positive. And then I said, put pressure on my hand and think negatively. And then they find they can push my hand down. So I'm kind of like, we through our theatre group, educate people about mental health things too, and make them feel accepted and a sense of belonging through our theatre group.
All right. So with that comes a responsibility that if theatre or the various activities you're involved in, you also want them to pay it forward, don't you?
Yes. So especially in the area of our theatre and I Choose Life, we always feel that, if you give, it's like Father Christmas, prescription, then they feel that you're in a power position. Yeah. But if they feel they can help you, then they feel alive, and they feel that they can actually contribute to society. Yes. And that's part of, I think, they say the footprint or the God print, where people, that we need the body of Christ. We need everyone to realize they have that gift. Just like that guy who was semi-comatose, he through his body being there, and just through his mannerisms could minister to a nurse who was in tears, who felt valued and felt love. Yes. So much so to someone who acts Jesus in the Passion Play and ministers to people. Yes. That and it's a movie star, that every person has value, and and sometimes I can sort of remember people who feel very touched by love just through that whole experience of belonging to a group.
Geraldine, on that positive point, we'll leave it there. You've been watching Support Life, and that's all for our program today. Join us again next week. Goodbye.